This is the story of the people who searched beneath Ground Zero. When the twin towers of the World Trade Center collapsed, they created a whole new landscape. What looked like a field of rubble was merely the surface of an underground world of caverns, shafts and passageways, hundreds of feet deep. Through this devastated terrain, an extraordinary search was conducted, and often, that search was personal.
It became a mission from that moment on. I mean, it was a mission. The mission was Jonathan. The thought was that there's going to be voids, there's going to be spaces underneath of here, and there's a good chance that people are in these spaces, in these voids. So any place we found voids, cracks, crevices, we went in.
It began as a race against time to recover survivors, but quickly turned into an epic struggle to identify every fragment of human remains, so that no one would be forgotten, and no one would be left behind in the rubble of Ground Zero.
That place became the place where my brother was, and I wanted to find him. I got it tattooed on me. That's a picture of my brother James. It says, "Remember James, 9/11," you know. And our goal is, as always, to keep him out there and give him a voice, you know.
With access to the extraordinary footage shot by the emergency workers, this is the untold story of the search for the victims of 9/11. It's possible to forget just how enormous the Twin Towers were. 110 stories tall, they had dominated the New York skyline. Each rose over a quarter of a mile into the sky and was constructed from 1 million tons of steel, concrete, and glass. It was here that 50,000 people worked every day in some of the most important financial institutions in the world. Below the World Trade Center was a vast 6-story underground network with a huge shopping mall occupying 3 million square feet. Beneath that, there were car parks and 2 subway stations. On the morning of September the 11th, 2001, around 14,000 people had arrived for work when at 8:45 a.m., the first hijacked plane hit the North Tower. Just after 9 a.m., the South Tower was struck by a second plane. Very soon, both buildings became infernos. At 9:59 a.m., less than an hour after it was hit, the South Tower collapsed. In 10 seconds, the entire building disintegrated in an avalanche of pulverized steel and concrete. "30 minutes later, the North Tower also collapsed. A city in the sky burst apart into a scene of complete devastation. It fell to the ground with such destructive power, it created a whole new geography of broken steel structures and mountains of rubble, spread over a wasteland the size of 16 football pitches. Scattered amongst the remains was 600,000 square feet of shattered glass and the remnants of modern office life. Fires burned out of control. Within minutes of the towers collapsing, the search began. The hope was that there would be survivors. The man jointly in charge was Bill Keegan.
My job now was to go down to that pile of debris and figure out ways to rescue people. And we really thought that we were going to be finding people throughout those buildings and through those debris, in voids. And I told my men that. This will define so much of who you are. You need to do this with complete resolve and focus.
Soon volunteers were also arriving at the scene, and with the emergency services stretched, those that could help were actually allowed to join in. One of them was retired firefighter Lee Ielpi, who was desperately searching for his son, Jonathan.
I met up with many dads that were looking for their sons. Many sons looking for dads. I saw people from Squad 288. That's Jonathan's house. I saw them. They saw me. They raised their hands, they were somewhat excited, and I figured, great, here they are. And the only thing wrong is they put their heads down. So I went up to them and they said, did you find any of the guys? I said, no, none. You? No, none.
As well as retired firefighters, construction workers also descended on Ground Zero and offered to help. And so the searchers became an extraordinary mixture of professionals and volunteers, bonded by a common knowledge that somewhere beneath the surface lay their family and friends. One of the volunteers was builder John Cartier, who was looking for his brother James.
You're walking past something and you're saying, whoa, hold on, like your mind is telling you, hold on a second, let's rewind a second. What was that, and was that what I think it was?
What is that? What is that?
That's part of a person.
Is it?
Yeah.
And you look again, and then you realize it was, a piece of a human being.
In the afternoon, the first survivors were rescued from the ruins of the Twin Towers. 14 people trapped in a reinforced stairway in the North Tower were brought to safety in what was dubbed the miracle of Stairway B. One of the survivors buried alive when the North Tower collapsed on top of him, who lived to tell the tale, was firefighter Mickey Cross.
When I first got out, I was really amazed. I looked around and I saw there was nothing there anymore. There was that one huge piece of steel that was standing up about 70 feet or so above my head, and it was canted over a little bit. So it made me a little nervous. I said, oh, we got out now, this thing's gonna fall on us and kill us. I was thinking that. And there was still a lot of fires burning, so it wasn't that easy to get off the pile.
Mickey's way of dealing with his trauma was to go straight back to Ground Zero and start digging for survivors. Most of all, he wanted to find his best friend, firefighter George Kane.
I don't know if you ever saw the pictures of him with that big smile. Well, he was really like that. The only thing I think he ever took serious was firefighting. As a firefighter, we're all very serious. When the bell goes off and we go out with different people, that's when we get serious. But in the firehouse, it's kind of like the Boy Scouts. We just all have a lot of fun. Georgie was always like that.
Mickey's dream was to find George and bring him home alive and well to his mother Rosemary, who was also a close friend.
In the first couple of days, there was such a hope, thinking that they had bunker gear on, they were well protected, and people were saying there were voids in the stairwells, and so there was a tremendous amount of hope.
By the end of the day on 9/11, many thousands had been reported missing. One of them was James Cartier. Having searched for him all day, his brother John had to go home and break the bad news to his distraught parents.
My mother immediately started asking for my brother, and I told my father that I couldn't do it. I couldn't get to him. I've been there for him his whole life. And the one time he needed me most, I couldn't do it.
The search for survivors continued into the night. But with the rescuers suffering from shock and exhaustion, it was essential they had some time to recover.
It's best for you, it's best for the operation. If you go home, get your rest and come back in tomorrow morning at 0900. Thank you.
However, the prospect of going home without his firefighter son Jonathan was almost too much to bear for Lee ILP. He was aware that the whole family would be waiting for him, desperate for good news.
I knew by then the house was going to be full of everybody, and they're waiting for me to come home. And I didn't want to go home. Didn't want to, yeah. I could have stayed, but that wouldn't have been right. And plus I had to think about how I was going to work as the days progressed. So I figured, well, I have to go home. I want to get rest, and then be back in bright and early the next day, and then do the same thing. So getting home, I was right. The block was packed with cars. And everybody looked. The toughest part was the oldest boy, Andrew, was 10. Austin was 3, so it was still a little bit of a mystery what was happening. But having Andrew come out and just say, "Did you find him?" Yeah, toughest part. And then seeing the wife and the brothers and sisters. It's tough.
Some didn't go home at all. Shattered by the day's events, they slept wherever they were when they could stand no more. But the hope of finding survivors remained. It was the beginning of an epic search. In the days ahead, the rescuers would risk their lives entering the voids deep beneath Ground Zero. The rescue and recovery search at Ground Zero was deeply personal, even for the man jointly in charge of the whole operation. Commander Bill Keegan's personal quest began when he was given a list of the missing.
When I looked at this piece of paper, and I went right by her name at first, I saw my good friend Jean Andraki's name, that she was missing. She had literally changed my life. And it wasn't lost on me that now I'm here to find her. And I really thought that's what I was there for, too.
The day after 9/11, the search and rescue teams began a concentrated effort to find every survivor. On the surface of the rubble pile, bucket brigades sifted through the debris, while others cut their way through the impenetrable mesh of concrete and steel, excavating their way down.
There's a void in that comes in here, comes in over there, and get in underneath here.
Where chasms and voids opened up, rescue teams were sent in to explore. It was believed that many of the 5,000 missing would be down there, some of them alive, and that they might be able to survive for up to 2 weeks. As they made their first tentative steps into the darkness below, they spray painted their path downwards in case they were trapped in a fall. Even descending the first 20 to 30 feet was very dangerous, but it was a risk worth taking for Lee ILP, desperate to find his firefighter son, Jonathan.
We thought, well, we have a grace period here. We've got 2 weeks just to get into as many of these cracks and crevices and get down deep to find them. Going in, if you had to stop and sit down and think, you might worry that, man, this thing could come down any minute. So you just kept your mind active. You know, oh, look here, let's search here, let me see, should we move this, should we go that way? Because it might be easy to just say, holy, let's get out of here. You know, so you had to keep your mind focused.
During the first 50 feet of their descent, the rescue teams were confronted by a mass of twisted beams and crushed ceilings. Then they began to find signs of what had been there before. Further down, they discovered staircases that were almost intact, which aided their descent into the underworld.
Another van!
The deeper they went, the more preserved everything was. 100 feet down, they found an eerie world of underground shopping malls and car parks that in places were virtually untouched.
When you'd enter into a location, it looked as it did on September 10th. Some of the parking areas, the cars were in pristine condition. A lot of the cars were driven out of the place. And then you just go a few feet to the right, and you'd see utter devastation. So we would make our way into these nice areas and then get down on our bellies and our knees and start to crawl, hoping that some area would open up, and when we got to this open area, we would find people.
Some of the rescue teams worked their way through the chasms and stairways down to the remains of the World Trade Center subway station. Here they were confronted with surreal scenes of destruction.
That's the one we're in. That's the one we need to get to.
As the search for survivors continued in the voids, on day 3 came remarkable news. There was a cell phone message from a father telling his daughter he was trapped and giving his location. A rescue team led by Bill Keegan went down into the voids to find him.
I talked to this girl, and she was about 14 years old, I believe, and she said that her father had worked for the Port Authority, and that she had just received a message on her answering machine saying that her dad was alive, and that he was down in a certain area underneath 5 World Trade Center. The hair stood up on my back. It was such a moving moment to have this girl at home hearing those words from her father, having thought he was killed. And we went down into this area, but very soon we understood that it was a false report. Not from her, but what we later found out was that the cell phone satellites had become so saturated that they couldn't deliver the messages. But as the demand lowered, the satellites were sending those messages that had been stored on September 11th. So this message actually came from him before the buildings had come down. And he felt as if he was safe, but in fact wasn't and was killed.
The mission to find those lost in 9/11 was becoming more frantic and psychologically disturbing as every day passed. Some of those searching believed that their missing family and friends were still alive, like John Cartier.
I had to be there. I didn't want anybody finding my brother without somebody who knew him there. In the beginning, when I worked there, I thought about silly things like, well, he's probably not showered for quite a few days. So I'm not going to shower, because when he sees me, I don't want him to be embarrassed that he's dirty. So I'm going to be just as dirty as he is.
After 10 days searching, no one had been found alive since day 1. During this time, firefighters who had lost their sons began to be called the Band of Dads and spent every day sifting through the debris. One of them was Lee ILP, whose last hopes that his firefighter son Jonathan might still be alive were finally ebbing away.
And I got up hoping and hoping. You know what I hoped? I hoped that Jonathan got off his rig that day, flagged the cab down, and said, "I'm afraid," and left. And he was far away, embarrassed to call. And if he would have called, I would have screamed and jumped and hugged him. But I know Jonathan. But no, it didn't take more than that first week for me to realize that this wasn't going to be good.
2 weeks into the search, it became clear that there could be no more survivors. This might have been expected to bring an end to the search. In fact, the opposite happened. There was a new intensity as searchers became ever more determined to find the remains of everyone who died and not leave them behind in the rubble. With hopes of survivors now gone, the search became focused on identifying bodies. The man in charge of identifying the dead of 9/11 also had a very personal stake in all this. He was Sheer Rabowski, and his best friend Jeff was one of the missing.
Knowing that Jeff had been killed certainly made it easier for me to work the kind of crazy hours we were working, because I felt like I had a stake in this as well. It put a face for me to all the other victims, because it was easier for me to understand a family member or a friend sitting in front of me and talking about, this habit of their friend or that attribute of their friend. For me, it always came back to Jeff. And it made it easier for me to sympathize. It made it easier for me to cry with the family members.
3 weeks after 9/11, only 220 bodies had been identified, with no trace of the thousands still reported missing. The immense destructive force unleashed by the collapse of the Twin Towers had literally blown apart most of the people left inside. Some had simply been vaporized in the explosions. The human remains recovered on Ground Zero would be unrecognizable to their nearest and dearest. It was Shia's job to explain this harsh truth to bereaved families.
One of the imageries that I used to describe to families what was happening was, I said, you know, imagine, if you will, a giant blender with concrete and glass and steel and people in it. And then you turn the blender on and you leave it on for a while and you pour it out and you say, okay, go find the people. I mean, it's a horrible image, and we didn't say it to families coldly. But in an effort to try to get them to understand just how terrible these forces were that were acting on the bodies of their loved ones, we used things like that.
Shia knew that the main hope of identifying the dead was through their DNA. The families of the missing were asked to donate personal items like a toothbrush or hairbrush, which might contain their genetic code. This would then be compared with DNA extracted from the body parts in the labs. Shia's best friend Jeff was married to Heidi. She realized there was little hope the remains of her husband Jeff would ever be found. Nevertheless, she still gave Shia the DNA sample he requested.
Shia was not optimistic that we would recover anything, given that he was in the impact site, and so I was not all that optimistic that we would recover anything. But I had 2 hairbrushes, so I could let him have one. The toothbrush I wasn't gonna save. I mean, it was hard. Part of it was that, like, I don't want to give this to you because it's Jeff's, and it's all, you know, I don't have much left of him. So that's, if I had to, I had 2 hairbrushes, so I could spare one.
Spontaneous memorials and tributes brought solace to those left with no remains of their friends and relatives. The dream of Night Commander Bill Keegan was now to bring back the body of his close colleague Gene. He refused to give up hope, despite the devastation he saw around him every night.
When I walked the site, I had 3 radios. And one was to the NYPD, one was to the FDNY, and one was back to my headquarters. And whenever a call would go up, requesting a chief, requesting a chaplain, I knew that there had been a recovery. And I would always make my way over there. Because I was hoping that it would be Gene. That on that night, that moment, I was going to be able to say, I'll take this.
The search to find every last victim of 9/11 was about to take the recovery teams further into the voids.
This opens up into a large space. We may want to take a look.
As the ground above them became more unstable, their quest became even more dangerous. 8 weeks after 9/11, the World Trade Center site was taking on the atmosphere of a mass burial ground. There were still 4,000 reported missing. The mission to recover the bodies of the victims was entering a new stage in which those searching would have to face the harsh realities of recovery and identification. In charge of the night search was Bill Keegan.
When I would arrive at 5 o'clock as winter came on, I was arriving pretty much at dark. And they had the big stadium lights, and it gave it a completely surreal image. And the idea that the city was asleep and that everything seemed to be peaceful. But yet in this 16 acres, there was all this noise and the lights. And we were going through sort of harvesting personal effects and remains.
When human remains were found, they were transported in ambulances 2 miles uptown to the medical examiner's office. For those working in the mortuary, it was unlike anything they'd ever dealt with before. The remains were so fragmented and decomposed. The contents of the body bags were carefully removed, logged, and processed. Everyone had been working relentlessly for 2 months and were emotionally and physically drained. Yet they were still painstaking in their attention to detail to avoid the danger of misidentification. the ultimate responsibility for this lay with Shia Rabowski.
We had to keep track of the remains, and we had to know what we were getting and what we were doing with them, what had been done to them, where they were going, and where they were going to be stored. If you didn't know exactly what you were doing, you were going to end up making terrible mistakes. And the worst mistake of all would be to misidentify somebody or some piece of human being and give the wrong remains to the wrong family.
Every time human remains were uncovered, an elaborate procedure was put into place that gave the best chance of identification. Always at the back of Bill Keegan's mind was that this might be his missing friend Gene.
Guys would call me on the radio and say, we think we have somebody. You take your time because you want to, first of all, recover everything. In the beginning, you might dig with a shovel after you send the grappler away. And you start digging with a shovel. And then after the shovel and you start to uncover things, you may start doing it with a knife. And then after the knife, you start taking a rag and start wiping away the dirt.
The recovery teams developed an expertise in removing the crushed human remains with the utmost respect. Mickey Cross was still searching for his best friend George.
I watched him remove his person, totally enmeshed in rebar, you know, steel bars, and they handled the person with such dignity. It was amazing. They were referring to the person as her. Like the captain would say, move her this way, and you couldn't tell. They were able to tell for some reason, and they were referring to what looked like a piece of chopped meat, I mean, as her. Move her this. It was, I found it amazing.
10 weeks on, and the volunteers in the recovery teams remained resolute in their mission. One ever present from dawn to dusk since the day of 9/11 was John Cartier.
I remember the first bit of human remains that I found, and you're just sifting through, and then all of a sudden there it is. The remains didn't have the texture or the coloring that you would believe it to be. It was more like, you know, mixed with, you know, concrete type color, and I remember thinking to myself, you know, my God, you know, this was somebody, and in fact may or may not have been my own brother.
One of the most vivid memories of the searchers is of the overpowering smell of decomposing bodies. It was so all-pervasive, cadaver dogs had to be used to pinpoint their exact location. They led those searching to macabre scenes.
We would find people in groups. They were pretty badly decomposed. They were sort of starting to like liquefy. And so actually, as you're digging them out, you're actually in there. This liquid, it actually soaks into your clothes, and it was pretty bad that day. In fact, I remember lighting a cigarette. Not that I wanted a cigarette, I just wanted the fumes from the tobacco going up my nose, because it was really, the odor was pretty bad.
Going into the voids below Ground Zero became increasingly dangerous as clear-up operations continued above ground.
If we gotta start getting some shifting, the thing you need to look for is something that you can dive underneath and you're gonna be somewhat protected.
Like a huge beam.
Like this beam, dive in between the columns. As we're walking down, as we're working our way down, you wanna make sure that finally...
Retired firefighter Lee ILP was searching in the remains of one of the stairwells where he hoped to find the body of his son Jonathan.
I talked the chief I know into letting us go one last time because I just had this feeling. We went as far as we could. You walk, and then the collapse was here, so you'd walk, and then you had to get down and crawl a little bit, you know, and just look around and look around. Nothing. So we went back to where we had to climb up to get to where the stairs were. We did another look. Whatever it was, we did another look. And then on the floor, on this rubble area over here, it was a wet spot. We both looked at each other and said, and then you look up, and there was an arm that was hanging down. So, great, we got somebody. It makes no difference the person's not alive, We've got somebody's mom there, somebody's sister there. Now we've got to get to that person. Couldn't get to her. Couldn't get to her. I probably this close. Couldn't get to her. And there was no way to bring stuff down there. There's no way. And it wasn't the safest place in the world. I mean, it was a very bad place.
3 months on from 9/11, and Ground Zero was like a sacred site. Still only 265 of the estimated 3,500 missing had been identified. Memorial services like this gave comfort to families who still had no body to bury. One of those was Lee ILP, who still hoped that his son Jonathan would be recovered. Then, on the night of December the 11th, exactly 3 months after he began searching, he received an urgent call to go to Ground Zero.
11:30 at night, phone rang. A deputy chief by the name of Paul Farrell. He said, "Lee, it's Paul." He didn't have to say anything else. I mean, you're not going to call me at 11:30 at night, you know. I said, "Hi, Paul." He said, "Lee, we have John." I said, "Okay. Be right in."
When Lee arrived at Ground Zero, his fellow firefighters and rescue workers were waiting for him. They lined up to form a guard of honor.
The guys didn't want to look at me. But I knew, somebody would look, I'd give them a wave. I don't want them to feel bad because this is good. I'd give them a wave and then they'd wave back and do a thumbs up and all this, On the side was a Stokes basket. It's a litter, right? With a flag over it. So I knew that was Jonathan, most likely. Paul, the chief in charge, came up to me and put his 2 hands on my shoulders and said, "Lee, he's all there," which was very important. I said, "Thanks, Paul." I went over to Jonathan. I wasn't about to unzip the bag. I mean, it was 3 months, right? But I did feel him from his toes to his head, just for my own satisfaction. We picked up Jonathan and we carried him up this dirt road, which was now lined with guys on both sides. Put him in an ambulance and went with him to the morgue.
Jonathan was identified through his dental records. The recovery of his body meant Lee and his family could at last prepare for his funeral. As Christmas approached, some of the relatives who still had no remains of those they had lost went to Ground Zero to be close to where they lay buried. One of the volunteers in the Salvation Army tent on the site was Rosemary Kane, still desperately hoping for news of her missing son George.
It was approaching the holidays, and I knew I couldn't be away from my family for Thanksgiving, and I couldn't be away from my family for Christmas, but I had it in the back of my head that I would come here for New Year's Eve. I wanted to spend New Year's Eve with my son, and that kind of got me through the holidays, and I was focused on that. I knew that by New Year's Eve I would be able to come here.
The searchers too carried on their work, even on New Year's Eve. One of them was Mickey Cross, still looking for Rosemary's son George.
I was working with a crew of people, and we found a firefighter uniform. Somebody was trying to make out the name. We couldn't quite, it was dirty, so we couldn't quite make it out. And I kind of brushed it off a little bit, and I saw the name. I saw Kane, and I said, "Oh my God, this is George."
It was extraordinary that amidst 1 million tons of rubble, Mickey had found the remains of the friend he'd been searching for. But to avoid any danger of misidentification, he was given strict instructions not to tell Rosemary. Despite this, she sensed what had happened.
I said to Mickey, "You found George, didn't you?" and Mickey couldn't tell me. But they had found him. I was totally at peace. I didn't cry. I wasn't upset. I just felt like looking up at the stars, and it was a bright, clear night, and there were a million stars in the sky, and I just remember standing out there, and it was bitter cold, and just saying, thank you, God.
George's remains were positively identified, and Rosemary was relieved that she could now honor her son's memory with a funeral that would bring together all their family and friends. But some of those searching had still found nothing. For them, the nightmare of the events of 9/11 continued to haunt them. John Cartier knew that his brother James had been trapped on the 105th floor of the North Tower when it collapsed. In the minutes before, the family had said their last goodbyes to each other.
That morning, we received 4 phone calls from James. And the last phone call, he spoke to my sister Maria, and he said that, you know, he was on the 105th floor, and they were trying to find a way down, and they couldn't find a way. The last thing he told my sister was, tell Mommy and Daddy that I love them, and tell everybody that I love them, you know? And we know that my brother was alive at least 20 minutes before the collapse. We know that.
John had searched for his brother every day in the 4 months since 9/11. It had brought him close to breaking point, but he wasn't about to give up now. It was January 2002. 4 months into the search and recovery operation, there was still no remains found of many of the victims of 9/11. The pain of those left behind remained as strong as ever. Heidi kept going by keeping a journal in which she wrote letters to her husband Jeff.
With everything going on, I didn't have him to talk to, and I needed to talk to him. So after about a week after 9/11, I started keeping a journal that was just letters to him, telling him what was happening and how I was feeling. I never wanted to live without him. Never thought I would have to. What surprised me the most about me was that I never wanted to join him. That was what surprised me, was that I wanted to keep going as strongly as I did, and I really think that that was a testament to him and how much we loved each other.
The search for human remains was now widening to include the rooftops of buildings around the World Trade Center. It was here that 2 lower leg bone fragments were found, which had the same DNA as the sample Heidi had provided from Jeff's hairbrush.
One of them was actually found on top of Building 5, on the roof of Building 5. And given that they were lower leg bones, they sort of envisioned that he may have been sitting at a desk. And so the desk sort of shielded his legs from the blast.
Jeff had worked on the 94th floor of the North Tower in the center of the impact zone of the first plane to hit. Heidi was relieved that something of her husband had at last been recovered, but she still had one more question for their mutual friend, Shear, the man in charge of identifying the dead.
The most common questions that we got from all the families was, did my loved one suffer? Did my husband suffer? Did he burn to death? Did it happen quickly? And, almost without exception, one of the easiest things for me to answer, because the vast majority of the remains came to us without any evidence of what we call a vital reaction. And that means the person died so quickly the body didn't even have time to react to the injuries.
Shear was able to assure Heidi that tests done on her husband Jeff's remains proved that he had died instantaneously.
I mean, I remember actually after that conversation being in a very good mood, because I felt like after 5 months that was the best possible news that we could hope for, that he never felt anything and never knew what happened. And the months that I spent sort of agonizing about what if he was one of those people who was trying to decide whether they should burn or they should jump out a window. or they were one of those people who knew that they were going to die because the stairwell was blocked and they couldn't get down.
Many of those still searching for the remains of family and friends continued to be haunted by the violent death they had suffered. Bringing his brother James back home was a commitment that John Cartier could never give up on. But as time passed, this began to seem more like a dream than a reality.
I had a dream that when I run in the front door, there's my brother James with his arm like this, watching TV with my neighbor Joe. And then it hit me. I was like, oh, Jimmy, where have you been? Everybody's looking for you, you know? So he stands up and I'm hugging him like, I am like, you couldn't even separate us, you know? I didn't want to ask him what happened. So I looked at him and I said, tell me what to do. I don't know what to do anymore. Tell me what you want me to do. And he just turned around and he says, I want you to put me in a nice place.
By March 2002, immense progress had been made in the clearing up operations at Ground Zero. As the steady rise in the recovery of remains continued, so too did the success in matching DNA samples in the laboratories. With more sophisticated data analysis in place, there was a surge in identifications. And John Cartier's dream of bringing his brother back home finally came true when James's remains were positively identified in April 2002. His epic search on Ground Zero was brought to an end by a sequence of matching letters on a computer screen.
When we got that first phone call that let us know that James had in fact been identified, it was like hitting lotto. You know, it was better than hitting lotto because that's what we were fighting for. That's what we were looking for. That's what we set out to do, to find him and bring him home.
James was identified by matching the DNA from 2 bone fragments retrieved from Ground Zero with a DNA sample provided by his family. When the recovery effort at Ground Zero came to a close, the man jointly in charge felt an enormous sense of achievement at how many bodies had been found and identified. But Bill Keegan still had one huge regret. He never did find the remains of his close colleague, Gene.
It's a little tougher for me in some ways, I think, is because I was there. You know, and did I miss something? Again, I know that there's nothing more I could have done. I left it all there. But it's just human nature to think that.
In the end, over 1,500 of the 2,749 thought to have died were identified. It was an extraordinary achievement which helped bring to an end the agony of many families who needed to know what had happened to their loved ones on 9/11.
We were very concerned that most of the victims were going to be unidentifiable. And, you know, we chipped away at it. And we were astonished on a daily basis at the amount of identifications we were making. And looking back now at what was accomplished, it's absolutely unbelievable that 60% of the victims were identified, that almost half of the 20,000 remains were identified, is a testament to the unbelievable dedication of the people who worked around the clock to do it, and of modern science.
For the families who were able to bury those they had lost, there was a great sense of release after months of painful waiting and hoping.
To have to lose my son and to have to bury my son, it's the most difficult thing I've ever done in my life. To get through those days and to try to be strong for everybody. It meant the world to me that I could bring him home and lay him to rest properly, with dignity.
James Cartier was laid to rest on June the 22nd, 2002. It would have been his 27th birthday. His brother John's epic journey was finally over.
When we buried James, we gave him a wonderful, wonderful send-off, you know. And the brothers in the motorcycle club, you know, all got together and we all rode our bikes. And I had to be at least 200 motorcycles. And I just remember seeing this procession of huge, you know, it's a huge procession of motorcycles for my brother. And I remember thinking to myself, you know, in the midst of you know, all this heartache, saying, man, James would really like this. You know, he'd really look at all these bikes here for him, you know.
When Heidi Markinson buried her husband Jeff, Shia Rabowski stood with her by the gravesite.
The day that we buried Jeff, Heidi cried and I cried, and I felt like we were burying Jeff, and I knew better than anybody else what was in that coffin, but it worked. The grieving process, the burial, the mechanisms that we develop as a society, they work, and it's one of the reasons why what we were doing was so important, to give the families back some semblance of normality, anything that they could cling to so that they could move along in their grieving process.
It was the personal involvement of many of the searchers that made the recovery at Ground Zero such a success. The unswerving commitment of people like retired firefighter Lee ILP was finally rewarded. Lee was able to give a full ceremonial funeral to his son, Jonathan.
I realized that, you know, I have to get up and say something here. And I spoke, and I don't remember what I said because, like I say, I didn't write any of it down any place. Somebody may have recorded it. But for whatever reason, I said at the end, I know my son Jonathan is now in better hands, but I'd rather have him in mine.
Next tonight, 9/11, a filmmaker's perspective. Steve Humphrey's story of sacrifice and courage by New York's iconic heroes. The fireman's story